All right, now it's time to hear from Lauren McNulty. Lauren is a baseball coach. She has coached high school baseball for 11 years and is the head coach of a girls baseball program. Lauren holds degrees from Kenyon College and Cal State East Bay. Lauren's presenting, but we can't forget about the differences, baseball and America's obsession with sex segregation. Take it away, Lauren.
Hi, I'm gonna try and share my screen. One second. Okay. Alrighty, is that visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to know about the AIAW in a little more detail. I did know about them before, and it's always mind-boggling to me to remember how many female coaches lost their jobs. But yes, I'm Lauren McNulty, and I do have a master's degree in kinesiology from Cal State University, East Bay. And I've coached high school baseball, like hardball, for the last 11 years. And when I'm not doing that, I've been the head coach of a girls baseball program since 2016. And as I was earning my degree and coaching, I wanted to start answering questions about why things are the way they currently are with girls and women in baseball. And I recognize that my normal may be different from other people's. I played baseball with boys and then with men. And sometimes when I'm in the field, I get pushback when I say that girls can play baseball and even that girls can play baseball with boys. And I wanted to look into why we are told what we're told about women and girls in baseball and how these myths were generated. And I wanted this research to inform how I run my program. So before we start, I do want to acknowledge that from a sociological standpoint, none of this is groundbreaking. What I think I'm seeing is the continued disconnect between academia and application. Okay. So here are some of the questions that guided my research. I wanted to look at why is sex segregated sport so normalized? And I'm looking at this specifically in a baseball context. And as I began researching each quote unquote reason to keep boys and girls separate, I felt could be categorized, namely into physiological reasons, historical reasons, and sociological reasons. And sometimes there would be overlap. But honestly, from what I found, really only one of these reasons is valid. And I also wanted to look at why is our current system so hard to change, and what are the consequences of leaving it the way that it is? Okay, so the first quote unquote reason I've listed is physiology. And I want to talk about physiology first to honestly to get it out of the way. In the field, this is the go-to reason why most people tell me girls can't play baseball with boys. And I often have like traits or qualities that are listed at me. And so I wanted to take a look at each one. And I'm going to talk more about history later, but it's good to remember that at the turn of the 20th century, research and medical professionals were really trying to posit women as inferior opposites of men. And this research was really geared toward establishing white men as the standard. And this set the stage for systematic discrimination against women that could be justified. So when you look at the qualities that are supposedly like making women competing with men unrealistic, what you find is that these reasons fall under predictable categories. It's often an isolated physiological quality. There's a huge focus on average rather than overlap. Many people think that, you know, men are here and women are here, but actually the overlap is more like this. There is a lot of focus on, you know, physiological qualities that are irrelevant for a skill sport like baseball. And I found that some of the differences that we're seeing, when we watch different groups play, is actually indicative of different efforts to teach motor skills to different groups. So a couple of the first qualities that I want to look at are upper body strength and muscle mass. And one of the most straightforward ways to talk about upper body strength and muscle mass is to talk about pitching. Incidentally, this is Genevieve Beacom. She was pitching earlier this year professionally with men in Australia. But I want to talk about two studies that compare male and female baseball pitchers. The first one is a 2009 study called Biomechanical Comparison Between Elite Female and Male Baseball Pitchers. And the researchers in this study looked at a bunch of different variables, with male pitchers and female pitchers. And they found that in most cases, the pitchers were mostly the same. But in their results and analysis section, most of the time is spent on the 6 differences out of the 24 variables that the researchers looked at. And these ranged from placement of the stride foot, stride length, which is of course contingent on somebody's height, angular velocity of the elbow at extension, and notably upper torso and pelvis separation. And I have a diagram here that will help illustrate that. This is the angle that we're looking at right here. And studies have found that a larger angle there indicates more kinetic energy being stored in the oblique muscles and is indicative of more mature pitching mechanics. But the researchers really worked on accentuating the differences that they saw rather than the more numerous similarities. And for a while, this was one of the only studies on male-female baseball pitching. There was another one in 2001 that looked more at trunk movement and throwing injury. But last year, in 2021, there was another study that came out called Motion Analysis, focusing on rotation movements of professional female baseball pitchers. And this was a study that was done in Japan, and the researchers compared professional female pitchers with university male pitchers. And I thought it was very interesting that they didn't even cite the 2009 study because they found the exact opposite. Women had a larger angle between the thorax and the pelvis during the pitching motion. And what I think is fascinating looking at these two studies, which I feel is the elephant in the room, and I'm sure everyone else has spotted it too, is that while these biomechanics are interesting in terms of injury prevention, neither study looked at strike throwing ability. And that's the thing that I really care about as a coach. Can my pitchers throw strikes? Can they hit spots? And can they mix up speeds? And these studies didn't look at biomechanics as impacting real world game situations. They looked at isolated physiological qualities. They focused on average, not overlap, and they accentuated difference. And I thought that was really interesting to note as I was reading these. Next, I want to talk briefly about oxygen consumption, which includes VO2 max and cardiac output. And I know that studies have really emphasized women having less hemoglobin, which of course will impact how much oxygen can be carried in the blood. But it's also important to note that baseball is an anaerobic sport, not really aerobic, which makes VO2 max an isolated physiological quality that is kind of irrelevant for baseball. And in terms of cardiac output, there's the equation for it right there. It takes into account heart rate and stroke volume. Actually, studies have shown that women will compensate for lower hemoglobin concentrations with a higher stroke volume. So we have submaximal compensation occurring. And I want to also bring up a wonderful source that I used. It's McDonough and Papano's book, Playing with the Boys, Why Separate is Not Equal in Sports. They reference a 1999 study called Sex Differences in Athletic Performance. where those researchers hypothesized that women are actually just better at blood shunting, which essentially means that more oxygen or blood is sent to the muscles currently in use. So more research needs to be done in that area at the very least. And here are the two final traits I want to talk briefly about. One is Q angle. That first appeared as a measurement in the United States, I want to say in the early 1970s. And here is a diagram describing it here. Essentially, Q angle is the cross of two imaginary lines, one starting at the anterior superior iliac spine and going through the midpoint of the patella, and another imaginary line that crosses the tibial tubercle of the femur and also goes through the midpoint of the patella, making that angle there. And this has been used historically to try to predict patellofemoral or knee pain, but actually it doesn't really impact anything. Early research thought that the larger the Q angle, the more likely you were to have knee pain. And who is going to have larger Q angles? People with wider hips. But in more modern attempts at meta-analyses, researchers have found that there's not even a consensus on how to measure Q angle. Are you going to do it statically or dynamically? Is the person going to be moving while you measure it? Are they going to be standing still? Will they be standing or sitting? And there's never really been a consensus in the literature. In terms of trying to determine if Q angle has an impact, it doesn't impact how much muscle can be on a leg. And while originally researchers thought that a wider Q angle would negatively affect the force output of a leg, more recent research, most notably from a 2014 study titled Reevaluating the Functional Implications of the Q angle, that study found no correlation between Q angle and line of pull. So it's not really impacting anything strength or injury wise. And lastly, testosterone, for many people, this either is or they think should be the nail in the coffin of women playing with men. But it's important to point out that naturally occurring testosterone only accounts for 1 to 3% of the difference of athletic performance between males and females. And it's important also to note that this area is massively under-researched, but I would recommend a book that came out in 2019 called Testosterone, an Unauthorized Biography, that dives into this in way more detail than time constraints allow for today. Okay. So another reason for the pushback that I experience is that while boys and girls and men and women have played baseball together, this has just disappeared from what has been about in the mainstream. And we really see this happening around the time of urbanization and industrialization around the turn of the 20th century. And as we know, around this time, there was a huge masculinity crisis in America and Europe, owing to repetitive jobs on indoor assembly lines, contributing to a general feeling of loss of control. And also at that time, there was a huge rise in nationalism as immigration to the United States increased. And I do want to read you this quote from Dr. Ring of the University of Reno's book, Stolen Bases, Why American Girls Don't Play Baseball. The new industrial order promoted increasing rationalization and compartmentalization of society, accompanied by pseudoscientific theories about the differences between men and women. For the first time in history, the concept of gender, defined as the social roles of men and women, was linked directly to biology. And that's it right there. That I think is a huge part of why we see what we currently see in terms of like structure in baseball. At this time, turn of the 20th century, science was, busy establishing women's supposed inferiority. And we start to see at this time segregation in society and in schools. And baseball also begins to be tied to the national consciousness at this point. No discussion of baseball in America would be complete without a mention of Henry Chadwick. He's considered by some to be the father of baseball because I believe he invented the modern box score. But Chadwick was an English immigrant, and he came over to the United States and noticed that baseball had a strong resemblance to rounders and to English baseball. And when he spoke up about this, he was met with absolute rage for a couple of reasons. Number one, this would mean that baseball didn't have American origins, but that it had come over with immigrants. And also, rounders in English baseball were played by both girls and boys, often together. And rounders in particular was often played by English milkmaids. And it was a very violent game. I believe the modern term for what they would do in the game is pegging, where they would throw rocks at runners to try and get them out. And this was totally counter to this image of women as frail beings. And at this time, the idea that baseball could have foreign origins and be female was unacceptable. And it was actually the impetus for Albert Spalding creating the commission to look into baseball's origins, which is why we have the contrived story about Cooperstown. So we know that this history of girls playing with boys always seems new, because the history of women in baseball has been continuously eliminated from our cultural lexicon. At the time of industrialization and urbanization, everything about women was in question, from the strength of their bodies, the quickness of their brains, to the soundness of their minds. And one girl's success playing baseball might lead to systematic banning for other girls and women in that locale. And another technique that we see at play here is questioning whether something is serious or, real. Is this a publicity stunt? Are these regulation games? Did she really strike them out, or did they let her? So this technique adds in the question, can we believe what is happening in front of us? And a great example of this is Bloomer Girl teams, I think. For anyone who doesn't know, these were barnstorming teams. Sometimes they would barnstorm in a certain region or in a certain state. And they played against men's semi-pro and minor league teams. And many of these teams were integrated. They had men dressed as women who were called toppers. One reference of that would be to the wig that they sometimes wore to make them seem like they were women. And at least two men, I know the number is probably more, but Rogers Hornsby and Smokey Joe Wood, at the very least, went from playing Bloomer Girls to the minor leagues. And that really suggests that these teams were quite legitimate based on who they were playing and who came out of them. And I want to give a few more examples of this purposeful erasure and banning. In the top left here, we have Jackie Mitchell, of course. She played for the Chattanooga Lookouts, and in 1931, she struck out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig in an exhibition game when the Yankees had gone down to Tennessee to play against the Lookouts, who were a minor league team. And Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was commissioner at the time, voided her contract after this happened, based on the grounds that baseball was too strenuous for women. And I think the Lookouts had to pay her under the table for a bit after that, but she did end up touring with House of David following this. And media portrayed her pitching against the Yankees at the time as a stunt, but she had been playing baseball before this, and she kept playing baseball afterwards, which makes it seem less like a stunt, but more like she really got kind of screwed over. Down here with the bat, that's Margaret Gisolo. She led her American Legion team to the Indiana State Championships in 1928. And after they won, American Legion banned all girls from playing. And I think at the time they said they didn't have like the proper facilities, like bathrooms. And unfortunately, that's a familiar argument even today, unfortunately. In the bottom right, we have Eleanor Angle. And she signed with the Harrisburg Senators in 1952. And Ford Frick was the commissioner at that time. And it took about a day, but he voided her contract and then banned all women from baseball at the time. And then top right, the team photo, This is the Philadelphia Dolly Vardens. And this was the first women's professional baseball team in the United States. And all of the players were African-American women. But many newspapers of the time refused to even write about them. And when they did, they would describe maybe what they were wearing or, be shocked that they were good ball players. So we see this, erasure and purposeful banning in many different contexts here. So we've seen and maybe already knew that sex segregation and exclusion in baseball is not a result of minor physical differences, and that early historical precedent suggests that women playing with men was happening early in the sport's history. And I want to go back to Playing with the Boys, the work by McDonough and Papano, with this quote: "Coercive sex segregation does not reflect actual sex differences in athletic ability." And there is a difference between coercive and voluntary sex segregation. Obviously, with coercive, you don't have a choice. You have to play with girls. And voluntary is more like, no, there are issues here. We want to be doing our own thing over here. And McDonough and Papano go on to describe that coercive sex segregation is the result of 3 inaccurate stereotypes: 1, inferiority; 2, injury; and 3, immorality. And I also want to point out that coercive sex segregation is both a result of beliefs, but it also helps create and perpetuate these beliefs. When we coercively separate boys and girls, the automatic assumption is going to be that the girls are the inferior baseball players. In terms of injury, a lot of arguments against integrating Little League were assuming that the girls would be hurt, but injury in sport and in baseball is a concern for everybody. And in fact, baseball has a much lower injury rate than other sports. And finally, immorality. McDonough and Papano described this part of their argument as keeping real sports to continue to display masculinity. And if girls are playing with the boys, and I quote, "This is an immoral disturbance of society." I've heard lots of times, we need to respect the game. We need to do this the right way. Like it's an insult for like certain people to be on the field. And actually, I think an excellent example of this, going back again to Jackie Mitchell, when newspapers were writing about her after she struck out Ruth and Garrick, there was a lot of a women on the field is an insult. This is a disrespect to the game. Baseball's getting too feminine. There was even a quip about how Rogers Hornsby would never allow women into the game, which is ironic because he himself was a bloomer girl. Most differences we see between males and females are the result of sociological factors. And this includes factors regarding motor learning. Most research points to differences as stemming from lack of training. And I want to read you this quote from Colette Dowling's The Frailty Myth. Eventually, the study of motor development brought scientists to the astounding concept that males' greater physical skills were chiefly the result of learning and practice. They were not a matter of superior physiology. And this has really been evident in studies about throwing with dominant and non-dominant arms. If you throw with your dominant arm, and if you haven't been coached, it's going to be terrible. And with your non-dominant arm, everyone's terrible. And unfortunately, in some cases, more effort is spent teaching motor skills to boys. Dowling gives a really poignant example of how if a girl is throwing wrong, say with a dropped elbow, there's going to be an assumption that that's just how it is. But if a boy were to throw with a dropped elbow, somebody in his family is going to step up and teach him to throw with his elbow, even with his shoulder. And I want to read you another quote from another source I came across called Sex Integration in Sport, Promises and Pitfalls. Men still tend to dominate elite levels of competition and perform disproportionately well in comparison to their female peers, almost certainly owing to a range of social, economic, and cultural factors embedded in contemporary sport. And I think it's really important to note that the researchers don't mention anything about physiological factors. This is a sociological issue. And some of these sport cultural factors were examined in a 1996 study about kindergarten t-ball, where they looked at a skill hierarchy and the power of expectations. And when coaches had lower expectations for the girls or any other player they deemed as having fewer skills, even if it wasn't true, those players were less likely to be high achieving or to continue with the sport. And that's getting more into sports psych. People will meet the expectations set for them. And finally, Dr. Ring talks about, like in Stolen Bases, how the rhetoric about natural athletic differences reveals our underlying fears about similarities, end quote. But we really need to consider that baseball is segregated, not to protect women from injury, but to protect men and the aura of male superiority. Title IX was groundbreaking in many ways, but with the establishment of the contact, non-contact sports paradigm and condoning coercive sex segregation, all someone has to do is say baseball's a contact sport, which it's not. And the idea of boys and girls playing together is thrown into question again. And as a society, we have forgotten that sex segregation is not a natural phenomenon, but something that has been imposed on us. And we are utterly convinced of its necessity. Coercive sex segregation helps reinforce the gender order that physicians were imposing during industrialization and urbanization. And coercive sex segregation will often fall into the trap of Michael Messner's concept of soft essentialism that assumes we're living in a post-feminist world, which we're not, and that girls and women can choose what they want to do, which you can't do if your sport is coercively sex segregated. Girls playing baseball by itself challenges the status quo, but only to a certain point. And coercive sex segregation just reimposes all these gender hierarchies on us again. So how did my research inform how I run my program? Well, creating opportunity isn't really enough for me. It matters to me how I do it. And so these are the best practices that I use and I always go back to. In my program, we encourage integration because we encourage our girls to play with boys on other teams if they want to, and to try out for their high school baseball teams if they want. One of the biggest reasons why girls switch sports is peer pressure. And I've been thrilled to see girls who maybe didn't want to play with boys right away, be around other girls who already are, and then finally decide to go play with boys themselves. So it's been awesome seeing that go in the other direction. I think if you can't integrate voluntary sex segregation with female leadership is key. My program is not a women's auxiliary to a male-run group. It's not coercive sex segregation in a male-run organization. We are our own thing. And I think it's important that girl-centered program needs to be put in a social and political context. Segregated physical activity can be empowering, but it doesn't challenge cultural beliefs and it doesn't change the status quo. And for a segregated program, I think it's good to have intent to integrate, if not now, down the road. And here are some of my sources and my email if you want to email me about any of the sources. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's just a starting point. So thank you so much for listening.